Hi there everyone, Nathan here from Mighty Lancer Games. Today we're going to talk about the basics of assembling models. So to assemble your plastic models you're going to need some basic tools. Here we've got some clippers. These particular clippers have a flat edge along the back which makes it easier to get a good clean cut when you're chopping the parts off the sprue. So they're spring loaded as well, you might notice, which makes them a lot more easier, comfortable to use. So this particular pair that I'm holding up here, this is a Citadel set that comes with one of the paint and tool sets. You can see how it still retains that flat edge and spring loaded for ease of use. The other thing that comes in the Citadel paint and tool set is a mould line remover. Now you can also buy these separately from a few different manufacturers where they've got a handle there, and basically it's just a piece of metal with a varied edge on, but not a sharp edge, that you would use to scrape across your model to get the mould lines off. You've also got some files here, so these are just some needle files. Now these are a set that I've had for some time, but were not particularly expensive, and this is a trusty craft knife, X-Acto knife. Other brands are available with a nice sharp blade in there. So blades tend to be quite cheap, a couple of pounds for a pack of 5, something like that. This particular one has a screw tightening system to get the blade tight, and it's made out of aluminium, so it's quite lightweight. You can get all sorts of different types of handles that make your life easy and the knife more comfortable to use. And of course a cutting mat. So you can see here we've got our green Mighty Lancer Games cutting. Once you've selected what kit you're going to build, we're going to use some Warhound Scout Titans from Adeptus Titanicus. You're going to unpack the box and make sure that all the parts are there. So a couple of bases, you've got several sprues, you've got some decals, you've got some instructions. So we're going to figure out from the instructions what parts we need to cut off the sprue in what order. Now Games Workshop have been very handy recently, and they've started labelling their sprues with a letter. So this is sprue A, and generally correspond to the order that you're going to need those parts in the instructions. So we've got multiple parts that we're going to cut off. We're going to take our clippers and we're going to use them with that flat edge that we described earlier on against the part, so we can cut those off the sprue as required. Now just fully inspect the parts before you start clipping, just to make sure that you're not going to cut off any raised detail or mounting points that might be required to join to other parts of the model later. But they do tend to put the sprue gates, as they refer to them sometimes, against particularly undetailed parts of the model. Work your way around the part, cutting the other gates from the part, and remove the part completely from the sprue. And do this for all the parts that you need for the current step or 2 steps of the instructions. So you're not cutting out all the parts and then you get them mixed up on your mat later. Just focus on 3 or 4 parts that you can assemble at a time. So once you've got all your parts cut out there, you're going to notice that there's these little blemishes on the part where you've cut them from the sprue, and these are the leftover pieces of plastic. So how do we deal with those? And how do we deal with these lines? So these are the mould lines that you can see here along the edge. So there's one of the little mounting points, and if you can see that faint line that follows its way all the way around the outside of that leg there. Okay, so this is where the 2 halves of the mould join together before the plastic is injected inside the mould. So there's a couple of ways that we can get rid of these. One is to take a file. So this is just a needle file with a half round finish. We're going to use the flat side of the blade just to lightly file that edge and smooth down where that blemish is. So you can see there that that's now smooth, apart from you've got that little bit of like dust fibre around the outside, so that's sort of static cling from the plastic sticking to itself. So one thing that you might have to do if you're going to use the filing method is take all your parts and just give them a wash before you move on to the next step. I like to remove these parts with a sharp knife, and cutting away from yourself, just gently shave those parts flat against the model, and this way you end up with kind of blobs that you can deal with fairly easily, rather than that fine dust shaving that you've or filings that you've created if you were using the filing method. And the other advantage to using a knife is that you can also use it for mould line removal. I'll show you in a minute. So just as you remove the various flash, just test fit the parts and make sure you've got a good joint. Now here's the leg, right then. So here's a mould line remover in action. So this is a little mould line remover you get with the paint and tools set. And just cleaning off one of those burrs that we saw earlier on, but using that mould line remover you can work your way around the part. Now one thing that you might see is that it was quite chunky, whereas your blade on your craft knife is a lot thinner and has a much sharper point on it. So this is why I prefer the knife, because you can get into a lot finer crevices and you have a lot more control with the detail of the model. You can get in. You wouldn't have been able to get that mould line remover into that tiny little gap there. So we're just going to work our way around the part, just shaving and scraping those mould lines off, so you can use the back side of the blade if you're using the knife, and then turn it around, use the front side for if you need more the sharp edge, if you need to get into more fine detailed areas. Just make sure you keep cleaning that debris away from the area, and then you'll be able to fully clean up your part. Once you've got your parts cut out, you need to make sure that they're all clean before you start assembling. So you can see this shaving debris underneath the Mighty Lancer Games logo at the left hand side there. Now that's the kind of thing that you want to make sure you've cleaned off all your parts before you start gluing anything together. You don't want to get those lumps and the dust that we generated with the file on the parts covered in glue, because you'll never clean it nicely in order to get a good finish when you're painting, or impeding even sticking the model together. So that's very important. If you need to wash the parts, go and take them to the sink and give them a good wash. Now let's talk briefly about using your knife in a safe fashion. So you need to make sure you've got a sharp blade, not a blunt blade, in your knife. Knife blades are relatively cheap, so you need to make sure that you change it. If you use a sharp blade, you won't need to put as much pressure on to be able to do the work that you require. If you're using a blunt blade, you have to require a lot more pressure to make the cut or whatever, and you're more likely to slip and injure yourself. Always cut away from yourself. Here we're using a A4 cutting mat, but you can use any kind of piece of wood or anything that's going to protect your work surface. You don't want to be putting holes in your kitchen table. So here we've got a few different pieces just to show you the technique. Now these are some dungeon pieces from Archon Studios from their upcoming Dungeons and Lasers release. Now you can see here the mounting points, so these came mounted on a sprue. You can see the mounting points there, and you can see the heavy mould lines that are on these parts. So they're going to need a fair bit of cleaning up. So same technique as before, but obviously these are chunkier parts. You can be not quite as precise with your cuts, and then just use the same sort of technique, shaving across the edge just to get rid of those mould lines. So a little bit up the side and on the top, so you can see where we've got these heavy mould line and these big lugs that we're just going to have to shave off there just to make this look something like. So just to give you an idea how much mess you can really make, we get the file and we give that a good going over, and you see how much debris that's created, just that one part on the cutting mat there. So this is a prime example of something where you'd need to go and wash the part. I'm going to wash all these pieces before we cut them off. So a couple of different viewpoints there, so you can see how much better they look once they've been cleaned up, and then ready for assembly and painting. Hopefully this has been useful if you're a beginner. Please follow us for more great videos.